A paramedic with 11 years of street welfare experience walked up to a structure built under a highway overpass and went completely silent. She had seen improvised shelters before: tarps, cardboard lean-tos, sleeping bags wrapped in garbage bags. She had seen people try, but she stood at the entrance of this one with her flashlight steady and just looked. Later she wrote in her official report that it was, and this is a direct quote from a medical document, more sophisticated than many cold weather interventions deployed by funded organizations. The man who built it had no funding, no tools, no training that anyone had given him a certificate for. He had a cracked thermometer, a piece of wool he found under a highway barrier, and a way of thinking about heat that most engineers never develop. The blizzard that night dropped the temperature to 4 degrees. Inside what he built, it held at 24. This is how he did it. The man under the overpass never lost heat. His name was Marcus. He was 53 years old. He had served 2 tours, come home to a country that had rearranged itself without him, and spent the better part of 4 years rebuilding a life that kept collapsing at the foundation through no fault of his own. A landlord who sold out, a job that evaporated when the warehouse automated its loading dock, a brother who tried but had his own trouble. Marcus had been unhoused for 19 months. He was not a passive man. He was not broken. He was methodical, patient, and extraordinarily precise about problems that could be solved with physical intelligence and attention. The military had given him that much, even if it had also taken other things. He had been sleeping rough in 4 different locations before he found the overpass. Not finding it the way you stumble onto something. Found it the way an engineer finds a solution, by walking the problem from every angle, listing constraints, looking for structure that could be repurposed. He needed something with overhead coverage, partial wind deflection from at least 2 directions, a surface that wasn't soil that would conduct cold from below, and enough invisibility that he wouldn't be moved on every 3 days. The overpass gave him 3 of the 4. The concrete deck above blocked precipitation. 2 of the bridge pillars formed a natural windbreak on the north and northwest approaches. The structural ledge where the road deck met the embankment gave him a recessed cavity, not deep, maybe 4 feet of overhang, but enough to work with. The 4th constraint, warmth from below, he would have to engineer himself. He did not tell anyone what he was planning. There was no one particularly waiting to hear it. But there was a scatter of other men and one woman who cycled through that stretch of the embankment on cold nights. Not a community exactly, more like a slow-moving gravity of shared circumstance. They watched him carry things. They didn't say much. The woman, who went by her last name, Devereaux, said he looked like he was building a fort. She didn't say it meanly. She said it the way you describe something you don't quite believe. Marcus didn't explain. He kept carrying things. What he built would eventually be described, by the one paramedic who saw it during a welfare check 3 days after the blizzard, as the most thought-out improvised insulation system she had ever seen in a non-structural context. She had been doing street welfare checks for 11 years. She wasn't given to hyperbole. When she said it quietly, standing at the entrance to what Marcus had created, holding her flashlight steady, just looking. But that moment comes later. Before the proof, there is the work. And before the work, there is the understanding of why it was necessary. Not just as survival, but as something Marcus approached the way he had once approached the problem of keeping equipment functional at 30 below in a wind that wanted to stop all moving parts. The military trains certain kinds of thinking into certain kinds of people, and Marcus had been one of them. Not reckless, not impulsive, diagnostic. He thought in systems. He thought in failure modes. He thought about what happens when the one thing you were counting on stops working. He had spent 2 weeks watching the overpass before he began. Watching where water ran when it rained, where it pooled, where the wind changed direction as it moved through the concrete columns, where the ambient temperature felt different at different hours. He tracked the frost line on the embankment concrete. He noticed that the section of ground directly beneath the deepest overhang stayed marginally drier and fractionally warmer, not because of any trapped heat, but because of reduced radiative cooling from the sky. An open sky at night acts as a heat sink. A covered surface doesn't. Marcus understood this not in textbook language, but in the practical language of a man who had watched water pipes freeze in places people thought were protected and stay liquid in places that looked exposed. He began with the ground. Everything begins with the ground, and most improvised shelters fail because people address the walls and the roof and ignore the floor. The cold you die from in a sleeping situation is not always the cold coming in from the sides. It's the cold rising from the surface beneath you. Ground conducts. Concrete conducts harder than almost anything you'll find in a civilian setting. On a clear night, a concrete surface can pull warmth away from a human body at a rate that a thin sleeping bag cannot compensate for. Marcus knew this in his bones, literally, in the way old cold lives in tissue and memory. He sourced his first layer of floor insulation from a furniture delivery company 2 blocks from the overpass. They put their packing foam in the dumpster every Tuesday and Thursday. Closed-cell foam, dense white blocks, the kind used to ship refrigerators and washing machines. He collected it over 8 days. He didn't take it all at once because he didn't want to draw attention and because he was thinking carefully about how to layer it. He ended up with enough closed-cell foam to create a floor platform approximately 7 feet by 4 feet and 4 inches thick at its thinnest point, 6 inches where he doubled layers under the section he slept on. Foam alone on concrete is good. Foam on concrete with an air gap beneath it is better. Marcus created that air gap by running 6 pieces of wooden shipping pallet underneath the foam layer, oriented lengthwise to create linear channels of trapped air running the full length of his sleep platform. The air doesn't conduct cold. Air, when trapped and still, is an insulator. The pallets he found in 3 separate places. The hardware store on the far side of the overpass kept them behind the loading entrance. Nobody watched the back of a hardware store at 11 at night. He was not stealing warmth. He was building it. The walls came next, and this is where Marcus made the decision that would eventually make the paramedics stand at the entrance and go quiet. Most people building a wind shelter think about blocking airflow. Stop the wind, stop the chill, stay warmer. That is correct, but incomplete. Wind is one problem. Radiation is another. A human body continuously radiates heat outward into any surface cooler than itself. In an open shelter, that radiated heat disappears into nothing. In a properly reflective enclosure, a meaningful fraction of it bounces back. Marcus had found 2 pieces of emergency mylar blanket in a kit at a donation center. The crinkled silver kind. The ones that look disposable and feel like nothing but reflect close to 90% of radiant heat. Most people use them once and throw them away or crinkle them into a ball at the bottom of a bag. Marcus cut them carefully with a piece of broken glass, kept the creases minimal, and affixed them to the interior face of the 2 walls he had constructed from layered cardboard and salvaged insulation batting. The cardboard came from appliance boxes. The batting, that soft fibrous film material used inside furniture cushions and mattress toppers, came from a dumpster behind a mattress store 2 miles away. He made that walk 3 times. He did not mind the distance. The cardboard was structural and thermal simultaneously. A single sheet of corrugated cardboard has an R value near 1. Which sounds negligible until you understand that 12 sheets glued together with salvage tape and pressed flat creates something with the rough thermal resistance of a thin fiberglass bat. Marcus built his side walls from 14 sheets minimum, reinforced at the corners with zip ties salvaged from a construction site refuse pile. He shingled the exterior so that the corrugations ran horizontally, which shed water better and maintained rigidity against lateral wind pressure. He had thought about this. He had thought about all of it. The mylar lining went inside those walls. The effect was a surface that didn't absorb the heat his body was generating. It returned it. Not all of it. Not even most of it. But enough. Enough that the interior temperature of his enclosure climbed measurably above what the ambient outside air should have allowed. He had a thermometer. He had salvaged it from a broken medical kit someone had discarded near the donation center. The probe still worked even if the casing was cracked. He ran it on a AAA battery he'd charged at the library drop-in. He documented the readings. On a night when the outside temperature was 11 degrees Fahrenheit, the interior of his completed enclosure registered 27. 16 degrees warmer than the open air 3 feet away from the entrance. Not warm in any absolute sense, but survivably warmer. The difference between a night you endure and a night you don't. He had also addressed ventilation. This is the detail that separates the people who have studied cold weather survival from the people who have merely thought about it casually. An enclosed space with a human body inside it produces moisture from breath, from perspiration, from the slow outgassing of damp materials. That moisture condenses on cold surfaces, soaks into insulation, reduces its effectiveness, and eventually produces a cold that is worse and wetter than what you started with. Marcus cut two small ventilation gaps into the upper corner of his enclosure, offset from each other, so air moved through rather than pooling. The gaps were small enough not to create drafts. They were positioned above where he slept so that colder, heavier air couldn't sink down and pool around his body. He understood convective dynamics in the same practical, intuitive way that a person learns them when the cost of getting it wrong is felt in the flesh. He had been sleeping in the completed enclosure for 11 nights before the blizzard came. Devereaux had watched him go in and out of the thing for a week. She had walked past its entrance twice on purpose, both times without saying much. Once she'd stood at the entrance for a moment longer than casual, tilting her head at the interior in the particular way a person tilts their head when something isn't what they expected. She had been sleeping in a combination of a sleeping bag and a commercial tarp. She was cold at night. She didn't say that, but her posture said it. One of the other men, a younger guy named Terry who had been cycling in and out of the Overpass location for a month, was less subtle. He told Marcus directly that he'd wasted his time. The thing looked like a trash pile. It would collapse. The wind would tear it apart. The condensation would rot the cardboard inside for a week. Terry said these things not cruelly, but practically, the way a person shares an opinion they genuinely believe is useful. He had camped rough 3 winters. He thought he knew what worked. Marcus listened. He didn't argue. He said he'd made sure the cardboard was dry before he sealed it. He said the mylar held it together more than it looked. He said Terry was welcome to feel the inside of it on a cold night, which was not a boast. It was just data. Terry didn't take him up on it. The blizzard arrived on a Thursday. The first advisory had gone out on Tuesday morning. By Wednesday night, the sky had the particular pressed wool quality that people who grew up in northern latitudes learned to read the way sailors read a barometer. Low, uniform, colorless, close. The temperature dropped 7 degrees in 4 hours as the pressure system pushed in. Marcus checked his enclosure twice that afternoon, once for structural integrity and once to add a final layer he had been saving. A piece of wool moving blanket he had found folded under a highway maintenance barrier a half-mile away. Heavy, dense, slightly oily with lanolin. He hung it just inside the entrance as a door baffle. Not sealed, baffled. It let air move slowly. It blocked direct wind intrusion. It reduced convective heat loss from the entrance by an order of magnitude compared to an open flap. He went in before dark. He did not come out until Friday morning. The storm dropped 7.5 inches on the city. Sustained winds ran between 18 and 24 miles per hour with gusts above 30. The overnight low hit 4 degrees Fahrenheit. 3 men sleeping rough in different parts of the city were hospitalized for hypothermia exposure that night. Shelters ran overflow protocol. The city opened 2 warming centers and community halls, and both filled within 2 hours of the storm's peak. Under the overpass, Marcus was alive and warm. Not comfortable in the way we use that word to mean soft furniture and still air. Warm in the way that survival uses the word. The way it means your core temperature is stable, your breathing is unlabored, your body is not cannibalizing itself for heat. His thermometer read 24 degrees Fahrenheit at the coldest point of the night, which was 3 in the morning when the wind picked up and the temperature outside his enclosure dropped to 4. That 20-degree differential, between 4 outside and 24 inside, was the direct consequence of every decision he had made. The foam floor blocking ground conduction. The air gap beneath it disrupts the cold bridge from concrete. The layered cardboard walls cut wind and provide insulation mass. The mylar interior reflects radiant heat back inward. The wool baffle controlling convective exchange at the entrance. The offset ventilation gaps manage moisture. Each element had addressed one specific failure mode. Together, they had created something that functioned as a system, not a pile of salvaged material, but an engineered thermal envelope built from found objects by a person who understood heat transfer in the way that experience and attention can teach a person when textbooks aren't available and the stakes are not theoretical. He ate a small amount of food he had stored inside. He slept in intervals. He listened to the wind move across the concrete above him and felt it push against the outer walls of his enclosure and then not penetrate further. He felt the wool baffle shift slightly at the entrance and then settle. He watched his breath visible in the flashlight beam. Still visible, still condensing, which told him the interior was cold by normal standards, but familiar, manageable, survivable. He thought about his younger sister. He thought about the warehouse that had laid him off. He thought about a meal he had eaten in a small city in a country far from here that he had never spoken about to anyone. He thought about the problem of spring. The enclosure was built for cold, and once the temperature rose past 40, the sealed foam floor would trap different problems. He would need to redesign. He thought about this with something close to contentment. The morning after the storm, Devereaux came to the entrance and called his name. He answered. She asked if he was alive, which was both obvious and not obvious at all. He came out, and they stood together for a moment looking at the city under its white layer, and she asked him how warm it had been inside, and he told her the readings, and she was quiet for a long moment, and then said something Marcus would remember for a long time. She said, "I thought you were just doing something to do something." She was sleeping in the enclosure 7 days later with his permission and a few modifications he made to accommodate the added body and the slightly altered ventilation needs. It was a paramedic named Vasquez who found them 3 days after that during a post-storm welfare sweep. She stood at the entrance with her flashlight and looked at the mylar-lined interior, the foam and pallet floor, the cardboard walls with their horizontal corrugation, the wool door baffle, and the ventilation gaps positioned at the upper offset corners. She asked who had built this. Marcus said he had. She asked how he knew what he was doing. He said he had paid attention. She looked at it for another long moment. She didn't write it up as a concerning situation. She documented it as a found shelter, structurally sound, thermally functional, with 2 occupants in stable condition. She noted in her supplemental report that the thermal engineering was more sophisticated than many emergency cold weather interventions she had seen from funded organizations. She used the phrase passive thermal enclosure, which is a clinical description of what Marcus had built, and which does not quite capture what it meant that he had built it. Later that winter, a social worker who read Vasquez's report made contact with Marcus, not to move him on, to ask him to explain what he had done, because there were 3 other encampments under other overpasses in the city, and the people there were cold, and the emergency blankets and single sleeping bags the city could provide were not enough when the temperature dropped below 10. Marcus spent an afternoon with the social worker, drawing diagrams on the back of a paper bag because that was what was available. He described the foam floor, and the air gap, and the cardboard layers, and the mylar, and the baffle, and the ventilation. He described the order of importance. He told her which failure modes to address first if resources were limited. He told her that the floor was always first. The social worker had a background in public health and had spent years working adjacent to the homelessness crisis in that city. She said later that the conversation with Marcus was one of the most practically useful she had ever had on the subject of cold weather survival for people without shelter. Not because the information was exotic or academically specialized, because it was precise, sequenced, reproducible, and came from a person who had tested it under actual conditions rather than controlled ones. There is a kind of knowledge that doesn't get preserved well. It doesn't fit into grant applications or policy frameworks. It doesn't look like expertise from the outside because the person holding it doesn't have the credentials that cause institutions to recognize and record what they know. It lives in practice and in memory and in small conversations on paper bags, and it either gets passed forward through informal transmission or it quietly disappears when the person who holds it moves on or is moved on. Marcus was eventually connected to transitional housing 11 weeks after the blizzard. He took it. He was glad to have it. It was a small room in a converted building with radiator heat and a shared bathroom down the hall, and the first night he slept there, he lay awake for a long time listening to the radiator knock and thinking about the enclosure and whether Devereaux was managing the ventilation correctly without him. He went back twice that winter to check. He made 2 modifications, extended the air gap channels on the floor platform, and added a second wool baffle layer at the entrance after a week of cold rain degraded the outer surface of the original. He showed Devereaux how to assess the cardboard walls for moisture absorption and how to replace sections before the saturation point compromised the whole structure. She watched him with the focused attention of someone who intends to remember. The enclosure survived the rest of that winter intact. What Marcus built was not remarkable because it was made from discarded material. Plenty of improvised shelters are made from discarded material and fail. What made it remarkable was the diagnostic precision behind each choice. The understanding that warmth is not one problem, but a collection of specific problems, each with its own physics, each requiring its own answer. Ground conduction is not the same problem as radiant heat loss. Radiant heat loss is not the same problem as convective exchange. Convective exchange is not the same problem as moisture accumulation. A shelter that addresses only one of these while ignoring the others will fail in ways that feel mysterious to someone who hasn't thought it through and obvious to someone who has. Marcus had thought it through. Under a highway overpass, with a cracked thermometer and a found piece of wool, and 14 layers of corrugated cardboard, and closed-cell packing foam from a furniture company's dumpster, and 2 emergency mylar sheets he had kept flat and handled like they were worth something. He had thought it through. For degrees outside, 24 inside, 20 degrees of separation between the world and what he built. There is a question worth sitting with after a story like this one. It isn't about materials or methods, though both matter. It's about what we notice and who we notice it in. The people most likely to have precision thermal knowledge gained from survival experience are often the people least likely to be asked. They don't present in the ways that signal expertise to institutions. They don't apply for research positions or lead workshops on cold weather engineering. They sleep under overpasses and they keep themselves alive through the same intelligence that, had it appeared in a different context, in a different person's history, in a different set of circumstances, might have been recognized for exactly what it was. The blizzard passed. Marcus held heat. Devereaux held heat beside him. The city woke up to cleared roads and the quiet aftermath of a storm it would mostly forget by spring. Somewhere in a public health archive, there is a supplemental welfare report with the phrase passive thermal enclosure. And somewhere in the memory of a social worker is a diagram drawn on the back of a paper bag that she has described to at least 4 other people in the years since that winter, each time beginning with the same sentence. There was this man who explained something to me. That is how useful knowledge moves, when it moves at all.